I want to thank everybody for attending this wonderful event on the occasion of the recent release of Raul Penaranda and Robert Brockmann's book, Escape a los Andes. I'm Guy Mentel. I'm the president of Global Americans. And for those who don't know, Global Americans is a think tank here in Washington that focuses on Western Hemisphere foreign policy with a particular focus on democracy, development, and human rights. Here at Global Americans, we have programs all throughout the hemisphere and are publishing daily at theglobalAmericans.org. Particularly relevant for this conversation, we regularly publish on the Andes and on issues that put Latin America and the Caribbean in a broader global context. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to find us there on our website and to begin engaging with the many events and reports that we're putting out. I want to start by thanking Raul Penaranda and Robert Brockmann for joining us for this virtual launch, which we are also recording. We are privileged and proud to be co-sponsoring this event with the Latin American Network for Education on the Shoá, also known as Red Lice. Shoá, of course, is the Hebrew word for Holocaust, and the Latin American Network for Education on the Shoá was launched in June 2020 due to the temporary closure of cultural centers, museums, and other commemorative monuments as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the sort of impossibility of continuing with face-to-face actions led to the rapid construction of this network of museums and nonprofit institutions that are all dedicated to the study and education of the Holocaust in Latin America. So as part of this network, there are institutions from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Puerto Rico, and Uruguay. We should also say that we are very glad to be doing this timely event right on the heels of Holocaust Remembrance Day, and as an institution, collectively playing our part in not forgetting the atrocities of the Holocaust at a time when Holocaust denialism is only growing worldwide. So we thank Red Lice for joining us and putting this event on, and we of course thank Raul and Robert for this timely contribution to the literature and for being with us today. Before I turn it over to Raul and Robert for their opening remarks, I want to quickly introduce each of them, and then again, I'll give them the floor and the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about this new book, Escape a los Andes, and what inspired them to write it. Raul is a Bolivian journalist and political analyst. He's currently the editor of Brújula Digital, a news and opinions portal. Raul is also the founding editor of 3 newspapers in Bolivia, Nueva Economía, La Época, and Página 7, now one of the most important newspapers in the country. He is the co-author or author of 11 books related to contemporary political processes in Bolivia and about the relationship between politics and the media, including Escape a los Andes. He is also, and we're very proud to say, a member of the Global Americans International Advisory Council. Robert Brockmann was a correspondent for the German press agency, deputy director of La Razón, president of the Bolivian Association of International Press Correspondents, and vice president of the La Paz Journalists Association. He is the founder of the Coca-Cola Foundation of Bolivia and the United Nations Association in Bolivia. Robert is also a photographer and was an official of the General Secretariat of the United Nations Organization for 16 years. His books have won the Franz Tamayo and the Bautista Saavedra medals. So I want to start by giving both Raul and Robert the floor for some introductory remarks about the book. And again, I want to thank them both for joining us today. We'll start with Raul. Raul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Guy, for your kind introduction. And of course, thank you to Global Americans for organizing this event. I want to thank also Red Lice for co-hosting this book launch. And I'm glad to be with you because, as you said, I'm part of the board. So for me, it's really a very good thing to be with you. Hochschild was a very well-known mining magnate in Bolivia, part of the 3 Bolivian tin barons, Barones del Estaño, together with 2 other important mining entrepreneurs, Patiño and Aramayo. But he wasn't known in this other side of his life that he almost hid in some ways, that he was saving thousands of Jewish refugees, allowing them to come to Bolivia. So he wanted to be known as a important businessman, but he didn't want to be known as something that is, I think, better. Someone that put his money, his time to save so many lives. We estimated with my colleague Robert that around 12,000 Jews refugees came to Bolivia between the year 38 and 40. So it's really a big number. In some point in 1939, Bolivia was the only country accepting Jews without a prior job or resources or any kind of money and any kind of quota. So that's important. All the countries around Bolivia in South America closed their doors. And in the US, they have this very tight quota, allowing only something like 30,000 Jews to come to the US, but they were 500,000 in Germany trying to leave the country. What Hochschild did was to work to convince Bolivian dictator Hermann Busch, who was the son of a German immigrant, to open the doors of the country in those terrible years. After that, he put in place a complicated system to allow the refugees to come to Bolivia and fund their travel and stay. Thanks to Hochschild, 12,000 Jews were saved, and after the war, Bolivia kept their doors open. So, and 8,000 more got to Bolivia. It's interesting to say that even after the war, once the world knew about these horrendous things that happened with against Jews, many countries kept, after the war, their doors closed. Hochschild had a cinematographic life. Besides rubbing shoulders with the most powerful men in the world and being himself a rich man, he escaped by a hair in 1939 of being executed by orders of the same Bush, the president of Bolivia, that he was his friend, and had an uncontrolled personality and killed himself a little later. In 1944, being one of the richest men of the Americas and a key player in the provision of Bolivian tin to the Allied war effort, he was first put in a jail in Bolivia, accused of illegal political activities, and after that kidnapped and almost murdered by a pro-Nazi officials of another Bolivian dictator. He left Bolivia in 1944 after the kidnapping. 2 years later, a mob lynched his very same kidnappers, hanging them in a plaza across the Palace of Government, accused of spreading terror in Bolivia. We tried to, with Robert, we tried to, in the book, to have a kind of biography of Hochschild, but more than a bio, because we speak about Bolivian politics. We, of course, what was happening in Europe of those years, in the US. But in respect to Hochschild, we want to do all the shades, all the grays. In Bolivia, Hochschild was only considered, until very recently, a villain, a bloodsucker of his workers. Probably part of that is true, but we didn't know about this other side of his life, saving lives of other people. And also we try to have this very matizada biography of him. We explore the difficult relationship that he had with his son, with his only son, with his wife that he divorced and married twice, and with his managers. He was incapable to have, apparently, true friendships. So this is interesting because he's a guy that has many defects, but also virtues. And I think that that's interesting for the reader to have a very complex personality as Hochschild, as a character of our book, that made many things that were kind of we can criticize him a lot for many things, but also we can consider his life as a guy that saved so many lives. So probably that would be Guy for this brief intro.
Thank you so much, Raul. I'll turn it over now to Robert for his introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Guy, and all the people and global Americans and those who are watching this. The very first time that this issue grabbed my attention was in the year 2001, when I was doing a photographic essay in Bolivia, which was going to be called "The Multicultural Death." I was going to take pictures of different cemeteries in my hometown of Cochabamba, which I knew best because my grandparents were in the German cemetery, and I knew this cemetery very well. It was very intimate, very German, very cozy with gravestones and so on. And right neighboring with wall to wall was the Lebanese cemetery, which is with its own architecture, with the crescent moon and this cupolas in the shape of onions. And then in front of the street was the Croatian cemetery. And then I knew that there was a Jewish cemetery somewhere, so I looked for it. And when I found it, I was completely astounded, because not only because of the size of the cemetery, but because of the cultural visual impact that made on me. It was very identifiable. It had its very own visual cues, gravestones and obelisks and so on. But what most called my attention was the size. I come from a German family which had immigrated to Bolivia in the early 20th century. And the German community in Bolivia it has a long standing, but it was nowhere as big as the cemetery was nowhere as big as the Jewish cemetery. And I said, where are all these people? Because there were almost no Jews that you knew personally, so very few exceptions. So I wondered where these people went. So time went by, and I wrote some books, and because of one of those books, a very famed Bolivian historian whose name is Mariano Baptista gave me an envelope with documents that said that Mauricio Hochschild had a relationship with the dictator Hermann Busch, and there were some clues about what he had done with the rescuing of people. So I thought, in the late 1930s, the cities of La Paz and Cochabamba, perhaps Sucre, they must have been a very interesting places because of this migration. There must have been thousands of Jews here. And then in the year 2017, using those papers that had been handed to me, I published a biography of Hermann Busch. And in a couple of chapters, there are some details about the dealings of Busch and Hochschild for the bringing of an important number of Jewish refugees to Bolivia. Bolivia was then a country which, in the late 30s, which was coming out of losing a war, the Chaco War between 32 and 35. It was a very poor country which had no possibilities of absorbing such a mass of refugees. And you had to wonder how this had happened. And then, of course, when Raul and I dug into a lot of other documents that we were finding on our way and our research, we found that actually Hochschild had most of the time rejected the possibility of bringing Jewish refugees to Bolivia because of the lack of opportunities and lack of infrastructure, lack of almost everything. He was rather inclined to create a network of rescue, creating channels and bringing resources to bring Jews to Argentina, for example, or to other countries. And in late 1938 or mid 1938, when countries were closing their doors, and finally came the Reichskristallnacht, all countries finally closed their doors to Jews because they were coming out of Germany dispossessed. They were not willing to burden themselves with the large masses of refugees. So it is in this point where Hochschild says everybody is closing its doors. So there's no other way to receive them and to save their lives than to bring them to Bolivia. Let's bring them to Bolivia and see later what happens. Let's save their lives first and then see what happens. So it was he had not finished uttering the sentence when the ships were sailing from Europe coming to Bolivia, and they were here in a matter of weeks. In a matter of weeks, with a government, a state, a country, a society completely unprepared. Hundreds first and then thousands of Jews in the matter of very few months came in, and their impact was immediate, because they occupied every space, every available space in the small hotels and hostels and wherever there were renting spaces in Bolivia. And their impact not only in this regard, but immediately, because they had to earn their living. No matter that Hochschild had prepared for them smaller allowances that allowed them to make a livelihood, but they had to earn their living. So they began opening business, every kind of business. So their impact was huge. So then again, for Hochschild, it was most important to save their lives no matter what, and then he would see what to do with them in Bolivia. To do this, he partnered with Colonel Hermann Busch, who was the president of Bolivia then, and he convinced him to bring refugees in order to dedicate themselves to be farmers, to farming, because Bolivia is a very large country, and then it was almost empty. So he told Hermann Busch, we need people here. Let's bring Jewish refugees. And Bush said, well, yes, why not Jewish refugees? But I want to open my country to every person in the world of goodwill who's willing to work. So Bush actually opened the doors of Bolivia not only to Jews but to everyone. So and Bush was suddenly flooded with a torrent of letters personally addressed to him, and he was not prepared to answer them. There was no national governmental apparatus to answer this. There were no forms, there was no office, there was no one in charge of this specific thing. So he brought the letters to his ministers and said, well, solve this. And thus the whole matter ended up in Hochschild's lap. So that's the way how so many Jews came, as Raul mentioned, between 38 and 40, about 12,000 Jews, and then after the war, some other 8,000. There was a question I saw if they were only Jewish refugees. Most of them were. Some were political refugees, German socialists or liberals or so on. But most of them, for the most part, they were Jewish. As for the difference between Hochschild and Schindler, for example, of course, the title of our book is the Bolivian Schindler, right? I don't want to take any merit from Oskar Schindler, because he saved the lives of 1,200 Jews from the very jaws of the beast himself being at risk. Hochschild was in no risk from the Nazis themselves, save for a very brief moment, but his life was also on the line in a couple of times for this very reason. So that's my take to begin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert and Raul, for those introductory remarks. I want to answer one question also in the Q&A that we will be opening this up for the audience's questions later on in the segment. So if you want to include them there, then I'll be monitoring that throughout in the Q&A box. But you've given us, Raul and Robert, so much information, and I have so many questions. I think I want to start with maybe the most broad of all, which is so often the representation that we hear of Latin America during the 1930s and 1940s in connection with World War II, I think particularly in the case of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, among others, is that it became a sort of refuge for Nazi leaders, bureaucrats, and collaborators fleeing after the end of the war. But kind of those representations, they don't really place, in my view, much responsibility on the chains of individuals who supported their flight from Europe. And also, I think these representations tend to render almost invisible the very relevant flow of refugees and survivors who came to and kept on coming to the region from the 1930s to the 1940s. I think records show, for example, before the Second World War, there were no more than 100 Jews in Bolivia, yet by the 1940s, there were some 15,000. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of that historical memory and about this sort of backdrop to the book, and maybe what prompted you to work together on it in the first place? I know, Robert, you mentioned the documents that you received showing the connection between Mauricio Hochschild and Hermann Busch, but maybe what really prompted you two to work together on this specific story at this specific time?
If I can start with the first question, exactly. Bolivia is also known to have adhered famed Nazi criminal Klaus Allmann, and in many other countries also, especially in Argentina. But we didn't know about this other aspect that we were giving heaven to many refugees. Probably the answer of this is that Hochschild himself didn't want to tell. We interviewed to do our book to Adam Hochschild, the U.S. writer, who's a great nephew of Mauricio. Interesting. There were two Hochschilds, one here in South America, Mauricio and his brother Sally in Chile, but also Harold in the U.S. as an important mining entrepreneur. And Adam Hochschild didn't know about his uncle Mauricio. He knew about him that he was in South America, in Bolivia, that he was an important businessman, etc. But he didn't know. That is what he told us when we interviewed him. He didn't know anything about this other aspect. So, and he says that his father, Adam's father, didn't want, for example, to have Mauricio in his home to have dinner or anything. He only accepted him at his office because he didn't approve many of the business methods of Mauricio, and also because he married the wife of a cousin of another Hochschild. So they had Mauricio like at a distance, trying not to be too close to him. And for Adam Hochschild, who's part of the extended family of Mauricio Hochschild, it's a surprise now that this was happening, and his father and his grandfather never knew nothing about this. So I think that's an explanation of why we know much more about Nazi criminals being hidden in Bolivia or in other countries, but we didn't know about this story. And well, about why we did the book together. We are friends for so many years. We had classes together at the university. Robert mentioned how he got to this story. After that, Robert was also contacted by some old former managers of the company that provided him with a CD with many terabytes of information about this. We had also the mining archive in Bolivia that in 2016 was this very important thing that they discovered many papers of many documents of Mauricio Hochschild saving or trying to save Jews. So that was another way of having these documents. Myself, in 2017, went to Washington with a National Endowment Democracy Fellowship, and I was able to go to the Holocaust Museum, to the library and the archive of the Holocaust Museum, and we got much more information there. And finally, we found information of the Joint. The Joint, this is this international Jew organization that was very important in the 30s and 40s to saving Jews, refugees, and that this joint organization had a close relationship with Hochschild. And in the joint archive, there are many telegrams, telex, transcripts of telephone conversations. That was very important. In some point, we met in a party of with our classmates with Robert, and having a drink. We discovered that we were doing kind of the same thing. So we decided to do it together. I think that it didn't make any sense to write two books about Hochschild, so we did it together.
Great. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, as for me, regarding the first part of your question, it is, and we put it in the book, it is a great irony that Bolivia is much more known as a Nazi haven because of a couple of Nazis, most famously Klaus Barbie. Then there is this cameraman Hans Erpel, who worked with Leni Riefenstahl and a couple of others maybe. Than for having been the haven for 12,000 Jews or 20,000 Jews, which is a complete irony, and it has to do with I would say with collective psychology, and it goes a long time ago. For instance, after the First World War, the American ambassador, one American ambassador in Bolivia, was very worried because the top commander of the army in Bolivia was a German, and he saw it as a matter of German policy that Germans were taking the top jobs in the military in most of Latin America, which is only partially true. I mean, some Latin American governments were taking German officers for important jobs in the continent, but it was really a matter of local policy more than a German imperialistic thing, and but this became somehow a psychosis, let's say so. It's more or less what happened in Great Britain in between the wars in the early World War II, when they thought that German invasion was imminent and they were seeing ghosts where there were not. I mean, it's like I have the impression that since Latin America was so far away from the action in World War II, Latin Americans want to have had Nazis somehow in their history, and so every country that I know wants to have been some sort of a hub of Nazi espionage or something like that. And the truth is very, very parochial, actually. No, there were some Germans that of course worked for their country, but there's nothing spectacular or movie-like in this regard. So it's sort of collective psychosis that was lived in Latin America in those years, and it's greatly exaggerated. And of course, I mean, you cannot outweigh the number of Jewish refugees with a couple of Nazi refugees also, no?
Thanks so much, Robert. Robert, maybe I'll stay with you. I want to talk a little bit more about Hochschild and his biography. So he was born in 1881 in Germany into a Jewish family. He arrived in Bolivia in 1921 and eventually became, as Raul mentioned, one of the three so-called tin barons of Bolivia. He controlled, I think, around a third of Bolivia's tin production by 1937 and around 90% of lead, zinc, and silver exports. As Raul and Robert, as you both mentioned, actually, he was known to be particularly ruthless. And Robert, in preparing for this event, I read an interview that you did, I think it was with The Guardian, and you mentioned that the sort of villainous reputation that surrounded his life really served the architects of the 1952 revolution in Bolivia as, I think you described it as a necessary part of the nation-building myth. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about his biography, but also the fact that the archival evidence that you've both compiled show that Hochschild was also very involved in the international anti-fascist resistance. And of course, as we've discussed, he's helped save tens of thousands of lives. So can you tell us a little bit more about this kind of mixed sort of legacy that Mauricio Hochschild has today in kind of Bolivia's public perception, and then also maybe set the stage a little bit for how he arrived to Bolivia and what Bolivia was like when he did arrive?
Of course, Guy. Well, Mauricio Hochschild was a German Jew born in Germany who was related to a family which was he had an uncle who was the founder of the famous Metallgesellschaft, which was in its time perhaps the biggest mining enterprise in the world. So that's how he was introduced to the mining world. He worked in Spain and in Australia, and then returned to Germany, not having had much success. And then he decided to try his luck in Chile first. There he founded his enterprise. He brought his brother Sally to Chile, and he was a restless man. He was a restless entrepreneur. He was always traveling. You could always almost say that he had no home. And in his constant travels to the north of Chile, he noticed the quantity of the really mountains of ore that were mounting in the Chilean northern ports. And he said, well, if this is coming from Bolivia, Bolivia is worthy of taking a look. And he saw, in Bolivia, for 300 years of colony and some years of almost 100 more years of Republican independent life, Bolivia had been a mining powerhouse, especially for silver in the first time. And everything that was not silver, it was thrown away at the very door of the openings of the mines. And so there were great quantities of waste minerals there just lying, waiting to be picked up by someone. And this someone happened to be Mauricio Hochschild. He went there, he saw that there were mounds of tin that were to be picked up, and he mounted his industry around this. He was thus born the job of rescatador, the rescuer. That's the name of the local name of the man who, they don't dig actually in the mines, but they just pick up the rest of the ores. So that's how he made his fortune. And he was a typical capitalist entrepreneur of the early 1920s. Now he played by the rules that existed then. And he was, of course, he was an exploiter, yes, indeed, as they were his colleagues, Patiño and Aramayo, who were the other two tin barons, who were also playing by the rules. No, that's what was allowed to them. And as time went by, Bolivian governments were putting more and more measures of taxes and protection for workers and so on. And in the 1940, for example, there was an assessment. In 1939, there was an assessment by an American diplomat who said that perhaps the next year, up from 1940 and on, probably Hochschild would be more richer than Patiño, who was one of the richest men in the world. So he was really rich when he committed to the rescuing of Jews. He had huge amounts of money and resources, and most important of all, he had contacts. Because, as I said, he was a restless man. He spent most of the year, or at least half of the year, traveling. His home was ships and trains and hotels, and he was constantly visiting clients and politicians and so on. And he knew important people in Washington. Above all, it was very important, his lobby, the lobby that he made there, and in London, where he met with lords of the Chamber of Lords and so on, where he made lobby for the opening of their countries, to increase their quotas for the for the increase of number of refugees, until it was no longer possible. So more or less, that's how he built his career and his firms.
Yeah, go ahead, Raul.
Yes, just to pick up on that, and also your question. He was, after 1952. In 1952, we had an important, what we call, national revolution. The new government, the new president, Paz Estenssoro, nationalized the companies of the three tin barons, including Hochschild, of course. And from now on, we had a new history in Bolivia. This thing that Robert mentioned in that The Guardian interview. The new government needed to build a new nation, and to do that, they needed villains, and those three were the perfect villains, right? But the way that this new historiography showed them is just only the bad things, right? Only the blacks, not the shades, not grays, and nothing positive from the three of them. But of course, no one is totally evil or totally good. So that was what we wanted to show, that in the case of Hochschild, and probably also the two other tin barons, they had also positive aspects.
Thank you, Raul. I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. So again, I invite folks who are interested in asking a question to Raul and Robert to do so in the Q&A box. I see we have a couple. I want to ask one quick question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. And that question is, I think, one of the really important things that this book does is talk about the political dynamics in Bolivia at the time, and kind of more specifically about the relationship between Hochschild and Hermann Busch. And I want to unpack that a little bit more, because Busch was an interesting character in this whole saga, in the sense that he became president of Bolivia at a very young age, at a time in which much of South America was still aligned with Europe's fascist leaders. And Busch, for his part, was half German. His father was a German doctor who supported Hitler. Yet Hochschild managed to persuade Busch that Bolivia's economy could really gain and benefit from opening its doors to Jewish refugees. And then there was a bit of a back and forth that you talk about in the book, about Busch insisting his country didn't need city folk, but rather needed farmers. Yet in March of 1938, he signs this resolution ordering consular officials to allow Jews to enter Bolivia, particularly if they could be, quote unquote, useful to national activities. Can you speak a little bit to the dynamic between Hochschild and Busch, and maybe how Hochschild managed to convince Busch that this was a worthwhile endeavor? Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Bush is a very complex character, because in Bolivia he's considered to be one of the three presidents of military socialism. But military socialism has never been categorized or systematized. And actually, Bush was a child of the jungle, right? He was born in the northern part of Bolivia, in the jungles. He spent his youth and his childhood hunting and exploring the jungles. When he went to the army, he became a very famous explorer of the Chaco territory prior to the war. And during the war, he was a national hero. He was a man of action. He was a top commando who worked behind the lines. He was the most sought man for the Paraguayan army. And at the end of the war, he was the absolutely top hero. And it was only a matter of time until he took power by a coup. As a matter of fact, he materially produced 3 coups d'etats. No, he put in power 3 other people until he made a coup for himself in 1937. But his life experience was very limited because he was very young, very, very young. He had been in school for only 3 years, because he had mostly been homeschooled, because 2 of his sisters were teachers, and his life experience was limited to barrack life and so on. So who would he appoint ministers when he came to power? He appointed ministers, the members of the old regime. And this was a huge disappointment for people of revolutionary thinking, who were looking up at him as a revolutionary leader. And most of his, a little bit longer as 2 years of government, most of his government, he just tumbled between policies that made not much sense until the last 11 weeks of his life, when he took very revolutionary measures, one of which affected profoundly Mauricio Hochschild, and that's why he ended up in the opposite side of the aisle and being at the risk of being shot. So that was Bush. His father was German, and Bush was a very, very nationalistic individual. He was very patriotic. He would toast to Bolivia in every lunch at home with his family, and so on. But yet the concept of nationalism was alien to him until the very last days of his life, where he discovered the concept of nationalism. And that's what he would have wanted the rest of his life to be. But alas, he committed suicide when he was 37 years old. So we will never know what would have happened. And he would have liked to align Bolivia with Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo, because he was a staunch anti-communist. But then, interestingly enough, although he had these Nazi sympathies, he was committed to bringing Jewish refugees to Bolivia. No? So we could see this as a contradiction. But then again, I see Bush as a profoundly anti-racist person, because, for instance, there was a political party which was founded in Bolivia by his peers in the eastern and in the Amazonian part of Bolivia, which was I don't remember the name, the Nationalistic Party. I don't remember the name exactly, but it was supposed to be an exclusionary, racist, for whites only party. And Bush said, no, you are going to dismiss this party, or else I am going to shoot you. So and he would have done. So this party was dismissed, and then he committed to the opening the doors for Jews. How come so? Because he had not bought the whole Nazi idea. I mean, he was into authoritarianism, he was into hierarchies and all these things that are dear to the Nazi thinking, but he was not into the racist thing. So for him, Jewish immigrants or refugees were all to him gringos. They were gringos. They were European, no matter if they were Sicilians or Ukrainians or Danes or whatever. So it didn't matter to him. So that's his merit, and that's why it was possible for Bush, for Hochschild to come close to Bush, as Raul has mentioned in other interviews before. Bush saw Mauricio Hochschild as a father figure for him, because his father abandoned him when Bush was very young.
Maybe we'll get to some audience questions. I have a million other questions for you both, but maybe we'll get to some audience questions, and then if there's still time, I'll ask some of my own. So why don't we start in the order that they were sent? Robert, I know you answered the question on the amount of refugees. Let's maybe pair two together. So let's do Michael Goodman's question about Ernst Röhm serving as an advisor to the Bolivian army in the 1920s. And then we have an anonymous attendee asking if Bolivia underwent another leftist revolution around 1970. So I leave both of those up to both you and Raul and Robert.
Let me answer about the 1970 government, because Robert can answer the part of Rome. He wrote a book about that, so he can do that much better than I can. Yes, in 1970 we had a coup by a leftist general, Juan José Torres, that for a brief period of time, less than a year, he had a kind of a revolutionary government. They closed the Congress and they had something like a Bolivian Soviet represented by university leaders and workers and union leaders, etc. So yes, we had that kind of government, but it was brief. Most important than that, we had from 1952, the year of the revolution, to 64, we had 3 government, 12 years of pretty nationalistic, and we can say also kind of leftist policies in the country. The year 1970 was just a brief, maybe less important government. Up to 71, when Banzer, and I see that there's another question about Banzer, that he could be also considered a German Bolivian. Well, in a way, yes, his father, or I don't know, Robert's grandfather was also a German great. So much less than Bush, that his own father was German, but yes, Banzer is also a German last name.
Well, regarding the question about Röhm, yes, indeed, Ernst Röhm was a military advisor for a brief time between 1929 and 31. And most books of history mention the fact that Röhm quit all his positions in Germany and went as a military instructor in Bolivia, and then came back, and nothing else is known about Röhm in Bolivia. But then again, I wrote this little book. I brought it to, because I showed it in the Buenos Aires Book Fair. It's this Ernst Röhm, which it translates like soldier, rebel, and queer, because he was an active homosexual, and there are consequences of his homosexuality in German politics. You can find this book in Amazon if you look at Brockmann and Röhm. I'm doing marketing here. With that, I answer your question. Regarding Banzer, yes, indeed, Banzer is one of the oldest German names in Bolivia. It comes from the 1870s, I think. So his Germanness is very diluted, I would say.
Thanks so much, Robert. I'll note also that Escape a los Andes is also on Amazon, if folks want to find it there. But why don't we group maybe 3 of these together? We have 2 from Arturo Korzekansky and 1 from Oscar Bozoveri. Let's do so I'll read them out. Arturo says, I may have missed this, but did the refugees come solely because visas were handed out, or because of that, plus other assistance with travel or settlement? And he also asks, can you say more about how these refugees fared in Bolivia? I once knew someone who escaped to Bolivia, but then ended up relocating to Uruguay. And this is very similar to Oscar's question, which is, can you describe how the Jewish community evolved in Bolivia?
Let me answer the second question. Many thousands of Jews came to Bolivia, but also not immediately. Sometimes immediately they were seeking to go to other places. Before this interview, we were speaking with a guy about a book called Hotel Bolivia, written by Leo Spitzer. And that's what he says, that Bolivia was kind of a hotel, saved lives, but many went to other countries. Not Uruguay, for example, is one of the cases. The famed family of Jorge Drexler, who's a singer and won an Oscar for one of his songs. His father was in Bolivia, and they went to Uruguay, but to other countries also, Argentina especially, and Chile. Israel was created in 1948, so many went to Israel too, and of course the US. The Jewish community in Bolivia was vibrant and numerous, we think, up to the 60s, probably to the 70s. There are some books that show many activities of the Jewish community, with many people participating in different activities, sports and others. But probably late 70s and after that, they kept migrating, not because they were probably these late migrations, not because they were Jew that wanted to migrate, but because in Bolivia we export people, we expel people, not Jews, everyone. It's sad to say, because it's a country with many difficulties. But now the Jewish community is very small, bigger in Santa Cruz than in La Paz, but probably in the hundreds. Sad to say that many really left the country to look for better opportunities. The country wasn't prepared to give these many scientists and entrepreneurs and musicians, many kind of professionals left the country. Now the community is very small.
There are a couple other questions in the chat, but I just want to follow up quickly on that, Raul, because there was a piece in the book that talked about Mauricio Hochschild's warnings to international rescue agencies, where he spoke about German Jews that he viewed as kind of more assimilated to Western culture, and the preference that he thought would be given to them over Eastern European Jews, who might be identified as a bit more traditional or religious. And in the end, what ended up happening, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Eastern Europeans made up most of the refugees, and that ultimately, in part, as Hochschild warned, prompted resentment of the local population in Bolivia's main cities like La Paz and Sucre and Potosí. Is that read correct? I remember that piece of the book where Hochschild warned the agencies that German Jews, again, more modern and assimilated to Western culture, would be preferred to the Eastern European Jews who were also fleeing.
Let me answer first, and then Robert, I'm sure that he's gonna add something. Yes, Hochschild didn't like, and he was sometimes very explicit about what they are called the Ost Jews, the Jews from Eastern Europe, Polish especially. So he thought that German Jews and Austrian Jews were assimilated, modern, secular, and not traditional Orthodox like many of the Polish Jews were, and some from other countries, Russia, for example. So he preferred to have refugees from Germany and Austria, and there was a debate also in those years of the rest of the community, the Polacos, the Polish refugees. They were saying that Hochschild and the entity that Hochschild created to help the refugees had this prejudice against them. And that also made a conversation, and Hochschild in some point also bends and starts to give especially loans also to that part of the community, of the Polish community, maybe against his will. But he also was, of course, worried about his image, and it wasn't good for him that they were calling him a racist against Polish Jews. But it is true that he thought that that part of the Jewish community was atrasada, not modern like the other part. But anyway, like 2/3 of Jewish refugees up to 1940, to the start of the war, were from Germany and Austria, probably a little bit more than 2/3, and 1/3 was from Poland and other countries. But after the war, these 8,000 more refugees that came to Bolivia, almost all of them were from Poland. The one that sometimes like a miracle, they got saved, and they didn't know where to go, and they came to Bolivia. But that was after the war, not prior to the war.
Well, yeah, complementing this, there was of course an urgency to save first German and Austrian Jews, because they were in immediate risk. Up to 1939, as Raul has mentioned, most of them were the refugees that came were Austrians and Germans. And Hochschild considered that Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews, had their own mechanisms already. For example, there were quite a number. I don't remember the exact figure, but in Argentina there was a huge number of Jews who had come in the later part of the 19th century, aided by a German foundation led by a German Jew who was the Baron von Hirsch, who wanted Argentina to be colonized by Eastern Jews, colonized in the sense of agriculture. And then there were some Jewish organizations who organized, excuse me for the repetition, immigration of Eastern Jews specifically. So they had already their own network. And German Jews who were not natural immigrants had not. So he was urged to, he felt the urgency to save their lives first. And yes, indeed, there was, not only in the part of Hochschild, but I would say most German and Austrian Jews did not like to see themselves identified with their Eastern Jewish counterparts. In the many books that we read, Raul and I, about this, this is a topic that came often. No, for example, there's the biography of Werner Gutentag, which is kind of a conductive stream in the book. Werner Gutentag, who was a Jew, his father Erich Gutentag was very, very resented at the fact that the Nazis were putting German Jews and Polish Jews in the same sack. No, who are these Nazis? What do they think? Who we are? I mean, they think we are the same thing. No, it was kind of this idea, and I'm certain that Hochschild had this same feeling. As a matter of fact, we discussed this topic with Raul and with the Jewish community in La Paz. And we were told that indeed they were two separate societies living, giving each other's the back, not looking at each other's at the beginning in the first couple of decades. But afterwards, after the war, especially and towards the 60s, they merged and they became one society. So it's been quite a sociological process, and I think the question is very interesting to look upon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Robert and Raul. I'm going to get to one more audience question here, and then I want to stay mindful of time. But Catherine Litterber writes, and this is for either of you. I applaud the author's efforts to highlight Hochschild's noble efforts to save Jews from the Holocaust and the care taken to highlight the contradictions with Hochschild's business practices. The point about Klaus Barbie is also important. It's interesting to note that he came to Bolivia in 1951 through the rat line with the assistance of two Ustashi war criminals. It would be helpful if the authors could discuss the persistence of this Ustashi ideology within the Santa Cruz civic community and the use of the Nazi salute by their allied armed groups, the Santa Cruz Youth League. She goes on to say, it's interesting also to note how closely Barbie worked with Bolivian dictatorships in the 1970s and 80s. So to either Raul or Robert, whoever wants to take that one on. Yeah, go ahead, Raul.
Let me start. It is true that Klaus Barbie worked for Bolivian dictators, and it was really a very shameful part of our history. He was organizing ways of intelligence and also persecution of opposition leaders, etc. So that's true. The other part of this comment, I think that we can consider this a bit exaggerated. There is a right-wing movement in Santa Cruz that is opposed to the Bolivian government, but I wouldn't call that movement as fascist or anything like that. This is the second time that I see that this thing about the Nazi salute in these groups, but this really fake news. I mean, I'm a journalist. Robert, it is a journalist too. I cover the news every day. Never seen that Nazi salute in any Santa Cruz group. It hasn't been any part of our news cycles here in Bolivia. But it's the second time that I have this thing come up in a conversation. That would be.
Yeah, allow me, please. I'm uncomfortable about talking about extreme politics, extreme left, extreme right. But I have to say that Bolivia's government is very, very leftist, and there is a narrative that is growing, spurred by the government and its cadres, painting everybody else who is not part of the government or who is not in the very far left as a fascist. I would say that. So yeah, Santa Cruz is a very entrepreneurial. It has a very free market mindset as a society. So it's kind of a natural opposition of the government, of the Bolivian government. And there's not such a thing as the Ustache war criminals. I don't know if there were any. I'm not aware. I am a scholar who studies this thing. I never saw them, not even the mention. So it's a narrative that's being built by the extreme left, I would say, again, I'm not comfortable about talking about extremes, but yeah, this is not happening. Simply, this is not happening. Of course, Klaus Barbie and the dictatorships and those things are real, were real, but this thing currently is not true.
Raul and Robert, if I can, I want to close with one last relatively broad question, and you have been so generous with your time. This has been a really wonderful conversation. The book for me was again absolutely fascinating, and I learned so much from it. I wonder if you could just tell the audience here what message you expect the reader will get from it, and maybe if you could highlight what kind of lasting message you would like the reader to get from it, or the audience to get from today to remember going forward. What would that be?
Okay, thank you, Guy, and thank you everyone that participated to this. It's been great to speak with the audience about the book. I think that through the history of humanity, we had many evils, but many people that wanted to do good, you know, through our history. And I think that this book tries to show that not only Hochschild, but also Bolivians in general, you know, they had in very small towns of the 30s, thousands of people that looked different, spoke different, and eat different things, but there wasn't really anti-Semitism or violence against them in their own countries, with their own people and their own neighbors. They were attacked, humiliated, and they crossed the world to a society completely different, and they were accepted. So I think that that's also important. But I optimistic that in society there is always someone that wants to do good, to someone that probably doesn't even know, right? Someone that wants to give a hand. So with all the evils of the 20th century that was, you know, totally awful, we had also many people, not only Hochschild, many more, in Germany, in Poland, as you know, families hiding people in their homes, putting their lives and the lives of their families in peril, in risk of death, because they wanted to have a room with a family. Many people were saved like that. Anonymous heroes, really anonymous heroes that going through the writing this book, all the things that we read with Robert. There is one example in Poland that a family had another family that they didn't even know, but they knew that they were escaping. As I said, I think that that's a highlight of our book.
As for me, well, I wanted our book to portray the growing intensity of the measures, of the Nazi measures against the Jews, beginning with the boycott in April of 1933, which was terrible enough, and then to convey the message that you can always be worse. Always, I mean, a government, when given free hand on these things, it could go to the last resource, which is of course the Holocaust, no, because nobody stopped them in time. That was important for us. Then, if we think about the present times when there are persecutions of the Rohingya or the Uyghurs and so there has been a Holocaust in Rwanda in 1994, and then we have the thing that happened in Kosovo and in the 90s. I mean, it seems like we have learned little about this, and the fact that today we have agencies, UN agencies and multilateral agencies that take care of refugees and so on, speak good about the human race. But then again, when you think about it, they speak ill of the situation also. I mean, we don't need individuals like Hochschild or Wallenberg or so many others or Schindler anymore, because there are these institutions that save lives and take care of refugees and so on. But then when you think about it, we have evolved, but then again, always the shapes of repression and discrimination and racism have evolved too. So it's a never-ending history of learning. And we hope that this book sheds a light of hope upon how bad things were and how better things are right now, not being optimal, of course. So we hope you read it and you like it and you learn from it. That's what I would expect. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And I salute Mr. Claudio Hirsch, who is the grandson of Mr. Hirsch, who appears in our book.
Yeah, and I was going to mention on this question of the anonymity of heroic efforts, Claudio Hirsch put in the Q&A box there that his father was Mauricio's right hand, and he hadn't heard of this story until very recently. So I think that also is a testament to the important work that you've done with this book, and we're so glad to be able to talk to you about it. So again, we've gone a bit over time, but again, I think that's also indicative of the great interest here. But I think with that, we will close, and we want to thank everybody for attending this wonderful event in partnership with Red Lice. This was a really, really enriching conversation. And on behalf of Global Americans, we thank you again, Raul and Robert, for being with us today. And we thank you again to everyone who joined us here for this conversation. We look forward to doing another one like this very soon. Talk soon, everybody.
Thank you.